Blood trickled down Darius Johnson's face as the courtroom fell silent. Officer Bennett smirked, thinking the decorated Navy SEAL would stay down. Nobody saw the Admiral slip into the back row, phone in hand. Justice was about to arrive with thunderous force. Before we dive into this shocking story of racism and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about brave individuals standing up against discrimination. What would you do if you witnessed this kind of injustice happening right in front of you? Let's find out how this explosive situation unfolds. Darius Johnson never expected that a routine drive home would change his life forever. At 38 years old, Darius was the embodiment of American excellence, a decorated Navy SEAL with 15 years of distinguished service to his country. Born in Atlanta, but now living in the historic city of Charleston, South Carolina, Darius had built a peaceful life with his wife Maya, a respected hospital administrator, and their 16-year-old daughter Zoe. Their colonial-style home in a quiet suburb was their sanctuary, a place where Darius could decompress from the intensity of his military career. That fateful Tuesday had begun like any other, with Darius kissing Maya goodbye as she left for her hospital shift and dropping Zoe off at her high school debate team practice. Darius had spent the day at the naval base training junior SEALs in advanced tactical maneuvers, his expertise earning him universal respect among his peers and superiors alike. As the evening approached, Darius called Maya to let her know he was stopping by the grocery store before heading home. The family was planning a weekend barbecue to celebrate Zoe's recent academic achievement, and Darius had promised to grill his famous honey-glazed ribs. The streets of Charleston were quiet as Darius drove his navy blue SUV through the gathering dusk. The first indication of trouble came in the form of flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. Darius checked his speedometer, confident he hadn't been speeding. With the practiced calm that had served him through 3 tours of duty, he signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. Officer Richard Bennett approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his holstered weapon, a posture that immediately struck Darius as unnecessarily aggressive. At 46 years old, Bennett had a reputation within the Charleston Police Department, though not one he would proudly advertise. Fellow officers knew him for his harsh treatment of minorities, particularly African American men, but the thin blue line of silence had protected him from formal consequences. Through his side mirror, Darius observed Bennett's tense demeanor and made a conscious decision to keep both hands visible on the steering wheel. He wasn't a stranger to these precautions, having received the talk from his father decades ago about how to survive encounters with law enforcement as a black man in America. When Bennett reached the window, his expression shifted from stern to suspicious. "License and registration," he demanded, without offering any greeting or explanation for the stop. With deliberate movements, Darius retrieved the requested documents from his glove compartment. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Darius inquired respectfully. Bennett's eyes narrowed as he examined Darius's military ID alongside his driver's license. "You've got a broken taillight," he stated flatly, though Darius knew this couldn't be true. He had just had his vehicle serviced the previous week and had checked all lights before leaving the base, a habit ingrained from military discipline. "Sir, I believe there must be some mistake. I just had my vehicle inspected, and all lights were functioning properly," Darius explained calmly. Bennett's face hardened at the gentle challenge to his authority. "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" The word hung in the air between them, its deliberate disrespect unmistakable. Darius took a measured breath, maintaining his composure. "No, officer. I'm simply stating that I recently had my vehicle checked." Bennett stepped back his hand, moving closer to his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle now." Darius complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible at all times. As he stood to his full height of 6'2", Bennett seemed momentarily taken aback by Darius's powerful physique, honed by years of rigorous SEAL training. "What branch of the military?" Bennett asked, skepticism evident in his tone as he re-examined the ID. "Navy, sir. I'm a SEAL stationed at Naval Weapons Station, Charleston." "Right," Bennett scoffed. "And I'm the Secretary of Defense. You people always trying to claim military service to get special treatment." The casual racism stung, but Darius maintained his disciplined demeanor. "You're welcome to verify my status with the base Officer Bennett," he offered, reading the name from the officer's badge. Bennett's radio crackled to life. He stepped away to respond, then returned with a more aggressive stance. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered abruptly. "Am I under arrest?" "On what charge?" Darius asked, confusion evident in his voice but still maintaining his calm. "Resisting arrest and disrespecting an officer," Bennett replied, reaching for his handcuffs. "Sir, with all due respect, I haven't resisted anything," Darius pointed out, still keeping his hands visible. Bennett's face contorted with anger. "That's exactly the kind of backtalk I'm talking about," he shouted, suddenly grabbing Darius's arm and attempting to wrench it behind his back. Darius didn't resist, but his muscular frame didn't move as easily as Bennett expected. Frustrated, Bennett called for backup, reporting falsely over his radio. "I've got a combative suspect, possibly armed, resisting arrest. Need immediate assistance at Oak Ridge and Pine." Within minutes, 3 additional patrol cars arrived, sirens blaring. Darius found himself surrounded by officers, with weapons drawn, all responding to Bennett's fabricated emergency. Despite the gross injustice unfolding, Darius maintained his military discipline, knowing that any perceived resistance could escalate the situation dangerously. As he was roughly handcuffed and pushed into the back of a patrol car, Darius caught sight of a bystander recording the incident on their phone. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. At the station, Bennett paraded Darius through the booking area, announcing loudly to his colleagues, "Got ourselves a fake military man here, boys. Thought his made-up SEAL stories would get him special treatment." The desk sergeant, an older officer named Rodriguez, gave Bennett a skeptical look as he processed Darius's paperwork and secured his personal effects. While fingerprinting, Rodriguez whispered, "My son's in the Navy. I'll make a call." Back at home, Maya Johnson grew increasingly concerned as the evening hours passed with no word from her husband. Her calls went straight to voicemail, something completely out of character for Darius, who was meticulous about keeping in touch with his family. When the doorbell rang close to midnight, Maya rushed to answer it, expecting to find Darius with some explanation for his absence. Instead, she found Carlos Mendoza, one of Darius's fellow SEALs, with a grave expression on his face. "They've arrested him," Maya Carlos explained, stepping inside. "One of the officers at the station recognized him and called our unit. It's bad, really bad." Across town, Darius sat in a holding cell, his military training helping him maintain calm in the face of injustice. Meanwhile, Officer Bennett stood in the break room boasting to fellow officers about putting a cocky troublemaker in his place, unaware that his actions had just set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose years of unchecked corruption and abuse of power. 3 months passed with excruciating slowness for the Johnson family. Despite overwhelming evidence that Officer Bennett had engaged in racial profiling and fabricated charges, the case against Darius was moving forward to trial. The system that Darius had risked his life to defend was now treating him as a criminal, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone in his circle. Behind the scenes, powerful forces were working to ensure Bennett's version of events remained the official narrative. District Attorney Victor Reynolds, a silver-haired political animal with aspirations for the state Senate, had close ties to Police Chief Wilson. Their relationship went beyond professional courtesy into the realm of mutual protection and advancement. Reynolds had built his reputation on being tough on crime, a dog whistle that often translated to harsh prosecution of minorities, while turning a blind eye to police misconduct. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Darius met with his court-appointed attorney, Sarah Carter, in a small consultation room at the courthouse. Sarah was in her mid-30s, idealistic, but increasingly weary from battling a system that seemed designed to crush both her clients and her spirit. "They're offering a plea deal," she announced without preamble, setting her weathered briefcase on the metal table between them. 6 months probation if you plead guilty to resisting arrest. They'll drop the assault charge. Darius straightened his shoulders, the perfect posture ingrained from years of military discipline. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do, Sarah. That would be a lie. And it would end my military career." Sarah nodded, having expected this response. "I know, and I agree with you. But you need to understand what we're up against." She pulled out a folder and spread several documents across the table. The police body cam footage from Officer Bennett has mysteriously been corrupted. Technical malfunction, they claim. Convenient Darius remarked, his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. What about the civilian who was recording? We've been trying to locate them without success. And the dash cam from Bennett's cruiser only captured part of the interaction, conveniently missing the escalation. Sarah ran a hand through her curly hair, a gesture Darius had come to recognize as a sign of her growing frustration. We have 3 witness statements, but they're all from officers responding to Bennett's call. They arrived after the situation was already escalated, and their reports all back Bennett's version that you were combative. What about my military record? 15 years of exemplary service should count for something. Sarah's expression darkened. D.A. Reynolds is arguing that your military background is irrelevant to the case and might actually prejudice the jury in your favor. Judge Walters seems inclined to agree with him. Darius had encountered Judge Harold Walters during preliminary hearings and had immediately sensed the man's bias. Walters, a 62-year-old fixture in the Charleston judicial system, had a reputation for giving police officers the benefit of every doubt while viewing defendants of color with inherent suspicion. Outside the courthouse, Charleston was divided over the case. Many in the community rallied behind Darius, organizing peaceful protests and social media campaigns demanding justice. Military veterans were particularly vocal in their support, outraged at the treatment of a decorated SEAL. But there was also a significant contingent of residents who automatically sided with the police, some openly using racist language on local news comment sections and at counter-protests. The Johnson family was caught in the crossfire of this community division. Maya had taken a leave of absence from the hospital after receiving threatening phone calls. Zoe, once popular at her high school, now found herself isolated, with some parents forbidding their children from associating with the daughter of a criminal. Back in the consultation room, Sarah pulled out another document from her briefcase. "I've been doing some digging on Officer Bennett," she said, lowering her voice despite the supposed privacy of their meeting. "This isn't his first rodeo. There have been at least 7 formal complaints filed against him for excessive force and racial bias over the past 5 years. And yet he's still on the force," Darius noted. "Exactly. Every complaint was dismissed after internal investigation. But I found something interesting. 2 of the complainants received visits from other officers suggesting they dropped the matter. One even moved out of state afterward." Darius absorbed this information with the analytical mind that had made him an exceptional SEAL. Intimidation tactics. This goes beyond one bad officer. Sarah nodded grimly. "I believe there's a network protecting officers like Bennett. The problem is proving it, especially when Judge Walters is likely to block any evidence of prior complaints as prejudicial." The conversation shifted to the potential consequences if they lost at trial. A conviction would not only result in jail time, but would trigger an automatic review of Darius's military status. A dishonorable discharge was a real possibility, erasing 15 years of distinguished service and cutting off his pension. At home, the situation was equally tense. Maya had found a dead bird on their front porch that morning, an unmistakable message from someone who wanted the family to know they were being watched. Zoe had started a social media account documenting her father's case, only to face a barrage of racist comments and threats. Even neighbors who had previously been friendly now avoided eye contact when passing the Johnson home. That evening, after a long day of trial preparation, Sarah called Darius with more bad news. "The prosecution has submitted a motion to exclude any mention of your combat decorations or commendations," she explained, fatigue evident in her voice. "They're arguing it would create undue sympathy and isn't relevant to the charges at hand." "What about Bennett's disciplinary record?" Darius asked. "Same thing. Judge Walters has indicated he'll likely exclude it as prejudicial to the officer." The legal playing field was being systematically tilted against them, with rules applied unequally to protect the prosecution's narrative. Later that night, as Darius sat on the edge of his bed, Maya joined him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Carlos called today," she said quietly. "Most of your unit is being deployed next week." Suspiciously convenient timing. Darius nodded, unsurprised. They're making sure I don't have my brothers there for support during the trial. Carlos says he's pulled some strings to stay behind. Something about a training assignment. He'll be there. It was a small comfort in a situation that seemed increasingly hopeless. Maya hesitated before continuing. Darius, whatever happens, we'll get through this. But I need you to promise me something. She took his hands in hers, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. Don't let them provoke you in that courtroom. That's what they want. Darius understood immediately. As a black man, especially one with his physical capabilities, any display of anger would be weaponized against him, feeding into the dangerous stereotypes that Bennett and others like him relied upon to justify their actions. I promise, he said simply. As they prepared for bed, Sarah's final words from their meeting echoed in Darius's mind. Our chances don't look good. The system isn't designed for justice in cases like this. It's designed to protect itself. It was a harsh truth that Darius had always known on some level, but facing it directly as the system turned its machinery against him brought a clarity that was both painful and galvanizing. He had faced enemy combatants in war zones across the globe, but now he was confronting an adversary, perhaps more insidious, because it disguised itself as justice. The Charleston County Courthouse stood imposingly against the clear blue sky, its classical columns and dome projecting an aura of permanence and authority. Inside courtroom, three tensions ran high as Darius Johnson's trial was about to begin. The room was divided both literally and figuratively, with the prosecution and defense teams at separate tables and spectators, seemingly segregated by their allegiances. Judge Harold Walters entered the courtroom, his black robes flowing behind him as he ascended to the bench. At 67 years old, Walters had presided over this court for nearly 2 decades, developing a reputation for swift verdicts and harsh sentences, particularly for defendants of color. All rise, the bailiff announced as the jury filed in. Darius, dressed in a conservative navy blue suit that Maya had insisted on buying despite their strained finances, stood with perfect military posture. His eyes scanned the 12 jurors who would decide his fate. Despite Charleston's significant black population, only 2 jurors were African American, both women who avoided eye contact with him. Sarah had explained that the prosecution had used various pretexts to eliminate most black potential jurors during selection. District Attorney Victor Reynolds approached the podium for his opening statement, adjusting his red power tie and smoothing his expensive suit. At 54, Reynolds had perfected the art of appearing righteous while manipulating facts to serve his narrative. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice resonating with practiced authority. This case is quite simple. On April 12th, Officer Richard Bennett was performing his duty to protect and serve our community when he encountered the defendant, who refused lawful commands and ultimately became combative, forcing Officer Bennett to arrest him for everyone's safety. Reynolds paced before the jury box, establishing a rhythm designed to hold their attention. The defense will try to distract you with irrelevant information about the defendant's military background. They will attempt to make this case about race. But this is about one thing and one thing only: respect for law and order. When an officer gives a lawful command, all citizens, regardless of who they are, must comply. As Reynolds continued painting Darius as an angry, entitled man who had disrespected authority, Sarah scribbled notes, furiously identifying each distortion and mischaracterization for her rebuttal. Darius remained impassive, his features schooled into the neutral expression he had maintained through interrogations in military training. In the gallery, Carlos Mendoza sat directly behind the defense table, his presence a silent testament to the brotherhood Darius had earned through years of service. Carlos had managed to delay his deployment, calling in favors from superior officers who understood the importance of supporting a fellow SEAL in his time of need. The rest of their unit had been conveniently sent on a training mission to Southeast Asia, effectively preventing them from attending the trial. Local media had gathered in force, with court artists sketching the proceedings since cameras weren't allowed. The morning's headlines had already set the tone: Navy SEAL challenges police authority, and military training makes defendant a threat, prosecution argues. No mention was made of Bennett's history, or the suspicious circumstances surrounding the arrest. When Sarah rose for her opening statement, the contrast was striking. Where Reynolds projected polished confidence, Sarah offered sincere determination. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is indeed about respect for law and order, but not in the way Mr. Reynolds suggests. It's about ensuring that those entrusted with upholding the law are held to the highest standards of conduct. She moved closer to the jury box, establishing connection through proximity. The evidence will show that my client, Darius Johnson, was subjected to a traffic stop without valid cause. It will show that Officer Bennett escalated a peaceful interaction into a confrontation based on assumptions and prejudices. And it will show that the subsequent arrest was not only unjustified, but executed with excessive force. Judge Walters interrupted counsel. I caution you against making unsupported allegations against the officer. Sarah nodded respectfully but continued undeterred. The facts will speak for themselves, Your Honor. Mr. Johnson has served this country with distinction for 15 years as a Navy SEAL upholding the highest standards of discipline and respect for legitimate authority. That same discipline prevented this situation from becoming even worse when he was confronted with unwarranted aggression. The first witness called was Officer Bennett himself, taking the stand with a confident stride that bordered on arrogance. Under Reynolds's friendly questioning, Bennett described a version of events that barely resembled reality. He claimed Darius had been speeding and had a broken taillight. He described Darius as immediately hostile and uncooperative, refusing to provide identification and making threatening movements. In my 20 years of service, Bennett testified, I've developed an instinct for dangerous situations. The defendant's behavior raised all the red flags of someone who might become violent. As Bennett continued his testimony, he employed carefully coded language never explicitly mentioning race, but using terms like urban attitude and typical behavior in certain communities that served as racial dog whistles to the plays, predominantly white jury. From his seat at the defense table, Darius maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as the lies mounted. Carlos, watching from the gallery, noticed something curious during a brief recess. Bennett approached Judge Walters near the side door to the chambers, and they exchanged a few words with familiar ease. It wasn't the formal interaction one would expect between a judge and witness, but something more personal, suggesting a relationship outside the courtroom. When court resumed, Sarah began her cross-examination, immediately challenging the premise of the traffic stop. Officer Bennett, you testified that Mr. Johnson was speeding. Can you tell the court exactly how fast he was going? Bennett shifted in his seat. Approximately 47 miles per hour in a 35 zone. And what device did you use to measure his speed? Sarah continued. Visual estimation based on my training and experience. Bennett replied, a response that drew skeptical looks from several jurors. Visual estimation, Sarah repeated. No radar gun, no laser device, just your visual estimation. That's correct, counselor. Police officers are trained to accurately gauge vehicle speeds. Sarah then produced maintenance records for Darius's vehicle, showing an inspection just days before the incident that had certified all lights as functional. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence as Defense Exhibit A, she said, handing copies to the court clerk. Judge Walters reluctantly admitted the document, but added, the jury will note that this does not prove the condition of the vehicle on the day in question. As the cross-examination continued, Sarah methodically exposed inconsistencies in Bennett's testimony. Why had he approached with his hand on his weapon? Why had he called for backup so quickly? Why did the partial dashcam footage show Darius with his hands visible at all times? Bennett grew increasingly defensive, his responses becoming curt, and his face flushing with barely contained anger. Are you questioning my judgment as a law enforcement officer? He demanded, after a particularly effective line of questioning. I'm questioning the facts of this case, Sarah replied calmly. Just one more question, Officer Bennett. Have you ever been the subject of departmental investigations regarding your conduct during arrests? Objection. Reynolds was on his feet immediately. Irrelevant and prejudicial, sustained Judge Walters, ruled without hesitation. The jury will disregard the question. When court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Outside the courthouse, a small group of protesters held signs supporting Darius, while a separate group of police supporters gathered across the street. Local news crews captured the divided scene, their reports already framing the trial as a referendum on support for law enforcement rather than a quest for truth. That evening, as Darius and Maya discussed the day's events with Sarah at their kitchen table, Carlos arrived with troubling news. "I've been doing some digging," he said in a low voice, checking that the windows were closed. "Bennett and Judge Walters are both members of the same country club. They play golf together twice a month." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's a clear conflict of interest. Walters should have recused himself." "It gets worse," Carlos continued. "I found records of 3 previous complaints against Bennett for racial profiling during traffic stops. All 3 cases were dismissed by Walters in preliminary hearings. The pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a pattern of protection and privilege that extended beyond individual bias into systematic corruption." As the team strategized late into the night, one question lingered unspoken in the air. How could they hope to win against a system where the referee was playing for the opposing team? Do you believe the justice system treats everyone equally? Or are there institutional biases that need to be addressed? Comment number 1, if you think Darius should continue fighting through the courts, or number 2, if you think he should seek justice through other means. Has anyone ever witnessed or experienced a situation where authority was abused? This trial is just beginning, and things are about to get much more intense. Like and subscribe to see how Darius handles what comes next. Can a Black Navy SEAL find justice in a system that seems rigged against him from the start? Will Officer Bennett's true nature be exposed before it's too late? The answers might surprise you. Day 3 of the trial dawned, with an electricity in the air, a tension that seemed to crackle between the prosecution and defense tables. The courtroom was more crowded than previous days, word having spread about the dramatic testimony and confrontations. Officer Richard Bennett returned to the witness stand for continued cross-examination. His confidence noticeably dimmed after Sarah Carter's effective questioning the day before. Judge Walters, perhaps sensing his friend's discomfort, began the proceedings with a stern warning to the gallery about maintaining decorum. Sarah approached the podium with a stack of documents, her strategy clear, methodically dismantle Bennett's credibility through his own inconsistencies. "Officer Bennett, yesterday you testified that my client became combative immediately upon being stopped. Is that correct?" Bennett shifted in his seat. "Yes, that's accurate." Sarah nodded, then displayed a transcript on the courtroom monitor. "This is the transcript from your radio call to dispatch at the beginning of the encounter. You described the stop as routine and the driver as cooperative. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Bennett's face flushed. "Initial impressions can be misleading. The situation escalated quickly after that call. So quickly that you didn't radio for backup until 17 minutes later," Sarah pressed, displaying the timestamps. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness," District Attorney Reynolds interjected. Judge Walters leaned forward. Sustained. "Move along, Miss Carter." Sarah pivoted smoothly. "Officer Bennett, you testified that Mr. Johnson made threatening movements that made you fear for your safety. Can you demonstrate these movements for the court?" As Bennett awkwardly attempted to mimic movements that never occurred, several jurors exchanged skeptical glances. Sarah then produced the partial dashcam footage that showed Darius standing calmly with his hands visible. "Does this footage show the threatening movements you described?" Bennett's demeanor shifted from defensive to combative. "The camera angle doesn't capture everything. I know what I saw." Sarah continued, pressing on each inconsistency, from the alleged broken taillight to the supposed resistance during arrest. With each question, Bennett's responses became more agitated, his professional veneer cracking to reveal the anger beneath. Judge Walters repeatedly sustained Reynolds's objections, blocking Sarah's most effective lines of questioning. When Sarah attempted to introduce evidence of a previous lawsuit against Bennett for excessive force, Walters shut her down immediately. "That matter is entirely irrelevant to these proceedings, Counselor. The jury will disregard any mention of prior cases involving the officer. Undeterred, Sarah shifted tactics. Officer Bennett, was Mr. Johnson's military ID visible when you examined his identification? I saw some kind of military ID. Yes, Bennett admitted reluctantly. And despite seeing that he was an active-duty Navy SEAL, you still assumed he was lying about his military service. Bennett's patience finally snapped. Look, I've heard every excuse in the book from people trying to get out of tickets. Military, government, you name it. These people always think they deserve special treatment. The phrase, "these people," hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Several jurors straightened in their seats, suddenly more attentive. Sarah pounced on the slip. By these people. Officer Bennett, who exactly are you referring to? Bennett realized his mistake too late. I meant people who break the law and then make excuses, he backpedaled. So my client was breaking the law by driving with a functioning taillight, Sarah pressed. You know what I mean, Bennett snapped, his composure fully evaporating. People from certain neighborhoods always think the rules don't apply to them. They never take responsibility for their actions. Reynolds was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is deliberately provoking the witness. Judge Walters nodded. Sustained. Miss Carter, confine your questions to the facts of this specific case. Sarah nodded respectfully, but had achieved her goal. Bennett's bias was now on display for the jury to see. As she returned to her seat, Darius leaned over and whispered, "He's losing it. Push harder." When questioning resumed after a brief recess, Sarah focused on the physical confrontation during the arrest. Officer Bennett, you claimed Mr. Johnson resisted being handcuffed. Yet 3 witnesses from nearby businesses stated they saw no resistance. Are all 3 of these unrelated citizens lying? Objection calls for speculation, Reynolds interjected. Sustained. Walters ruled immediately. Sarah changed tack again. Officer Bennett, is it department policy to call for backup when a suspect is cooperating fully, as shown in this footage? Before Bennett could answer, Darius spoke up from the defense table, his deep voice calm but carrying authority. Your Honor, I'd like to address the court. The unexpected request created a ripple of surprise. Judge Walters frowned. Defendants speak through their counsel, Mr. Johnson. With respect, Your Honor, I have a right to speak in my own defense, especially when my military service is being disparaged. The judge hesitated, aware that denying this reasonable request would look prejudicial to observers. Very well, but keep it brief. Darius stood, his powerful frame commanding attention without effort. I have served this country through 3 combat tours. I've led men into battle and brought them home safely. I've upheld the highest standards of conduct under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The suggestion that I would disrespect a law enforcement officer performing his legitimate duties is not only false but contradicts everything I stand for. The simple dignity of his statement resonated through the courtroom. Bennett, still on the stand, visibly bristled at the impact Darius's words were having. That's exactly the entitled attitude I'm talking about, he blurted out, ignoring Reynolds's frantic signal to stay quiet. You think your uniform gives you the right to question my authority on American streets? Judge Walters banged his gavel. Officer Bennett, you will refrain from addressing the defendant directly. But Bennett was beyond restraint, now years of unchecked bias finding expression. He rose from the witness stand and took 2 steps toward Darius. You people always hide behind service and sacrifice, but I'm out there every day dealing with your communities, seeing the real story. The racial animus behind his words was now unmistakable. Darius remained standing calm in the face of Bennett's advancing anger. Officer, I respect the challenge of your job, but that doesn't justify what happened during our encounter. Bennett moved closer, still ignoring the judge's orders to return to the stand. You disrespected my authority that night, and you're doing it again right here in this courtroom. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would differ in the details. Bennett lunged forward, closing the distance to Darius in 2 quick strides. I feel threatened, he shouted, the same words he had used to justify countless aggressive actions in the past. His hand moved toward his hip, where his service weapon would normally be holstered, though he was unarmed in court. Court officers rushed forward, but instead of restraining Bennett, they grabbed Darius, forcing him roughly into his seat, despite the fact that he had made no aggressive move. Blood trickled down Darius's face from where his head had been slammed against the table by one of the officers. "Order! Order in the court, Judge Walters!" shouted, banging his gavel repeatedly. When the chaos subsided, Bennett stood triumphant near the defense table, while Darius sat with a court officer's hand firmly on his shoulder. The racial dynamics of the scene were impossible to ignore, a stark visual representation of the injustice at the heart of the case. "Your Honor," Sarah protested, "my client was just physically assaulted in your courtroom by the prosecution's witness, and yet your officers have restrained the victim rather than the aggressor." Judge Walters glared down from the bench. "Miss Carter, one more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt." Mr. Johnson provoked this incident with his inappropriate address to the court. From the gallery, Carlos Mendoza held his smartphone discreetly, having recorded the entire incident. He caught Darius's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, communicating that he had captured the evidence they needed. As court officers finally escorted Bennett back to the witness stand, Judge Walters addressed Darius directly. "Mr. Johnson, any further disruptions, and I will have you restrained for the remainder of these proceedings." "Is that clear?" Darius, blood still trickling from the cut on his forehead, responded with quiet dignity. "Crystal clear, Your Honor." The courtroom atmosphere was charged with shock and tension. Several jurors appeared visibly disturbed by what they had witnessed, particularly the African-American women who now watched Darius with undisguised sympathy. Even some of Bennett's supporters in the gallery seemed unsettled by his loss of control. Judge Walters, recognizing the damage done to the prosecution's case, quickly called for a recess until the following morning. "The jury is instructed to disregard the unfortunate incident that just occurred," he announced, though the expressions on the jurors' faces suggested this would be impossible. As Darius was led from the courtroom still, with officers gripping his arms despite his calm compliance, he maintained the dignified bearing that had defined his military career. The contrast between his composure and Bennett's explosion had spoken volumes about the character of both men. In the hallway outside, reporters swarmed, capturing images of Darius's bloodied face that would dominate the evening news cycle. The story was no longer about a routine arrest, but about a decorated Navy SEAL being assaulted in open court while the judge blamed the victim. The breaking point had been reached not just for Darius Johnson, but for a system whose bias had been exposed in the most public and undeniable manner possible. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind them, Carlos Mendoza sprang into action. With the practiced efficiency of a special operations veteran, he slipped away from the crowd of reporters and found a quiet alcove in the courthouse's east wing. The 55-second video he had captured on his phone was already uploading to a secure cloud server insurance against any attempt to confiscate or delete the evidence. Carlos glanced around to ensure privacy before making a call on a separate encrypted phone, one not linked to his personal accounts. "Sir, it's Mendoza," he said quietly when the call connected. "The situation has escalated beyond our worst projections. Johnson was just assaulted in open court by the officer. I have video." The voice on the other end belonged to Admiral Raymond Wallace, a decorated naval officer with 30 years of service, and the commanding officer who had first recognized Darius's exceptional potential 15 years earlier. Casualties, the Admiral asked military shorthand for injuries. Minor laceration to Johnson's forehead, but the psychological impact is significant. They're restraining him while allowing the aggressor to move freely. The judge is openly biased. "Transfer the video immediately through the secure channel," Wallace instructed. "I'll convene an emergency meeting. Hold your position and continue observation." What no one in the Charleston courthouse realized was that Carlos Mendoza wasn't just a loyal friend and fellow SEAL. He was also a specialized intelligence operative with extensive training in evidence gathering and counterintelligence. His assignment to remain behind while the rest of the unit deployed had been no coincidence but a calculated decision by naval intelligence, who had been monitoring the troubling case since Darius's arrest. After ending the call, Carlos returned to the courtroom area, where Sarah Carter was attempting to get the court officers to allow her client proper medical attention for his injury. "He needs a doctor to examine that cut," she insisted, while the officers maintained that the courthouse medic would suffice. Carlos approached his military bearing, subtly intimidating, even to the court officers. "Miss Carter, I've contacted some associates who might be able to help with the situation," he said meaningfully. "Perhaps we could discuss," while Mr. bowed. "Johnson receives medical attention." Sarah caught the significance in his tone and nodded. "Officers, my client has the right to speak with his support person. I insist you allow them a moment of privacy in the medical room." Reluctantly, the court officers agreed, escorting Darius to a small first aid station down the hall with Carlos and Sarah following. Once the door closed behind them, Carlos spoke in a hushed tone. "The video is secured and being reviewed at the highest levels. Admiral Wallace is personally involved now." Darius, pressing a gauze pad to his forehead, looked up with surprise. "The Admiral, I haven't served under him in years. He's never forgotten your actions in Kandahar," Carlos replied. "When he heard about your case, he began pulling strings behind the scenes. What happened today was the last straw." Sarah looked between the two men with growing understanding. "You're not just here as a friend, are you, Carlos?" Carlos shook his head. "Naval intelligence has been monitoring this situation since the arrest. We had suspicions about corruption in this jurisdiction but needed evidence. Today provided it." While this conversation took place in the courthouse, Admiral Wallace was viewing the video footage in a secure command center at the Pentagon. Surrounding him were representatives from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, military police, and federal law enforcement. "This goes beyond a single biased officer," Wallace stated, replaying the footage of Bennett's aggressive advance toward Darius and the court officer's discriminatory response. "Our preliminary investigation suggests a pattern of coordinated corruption involving multiple levels of local law enforcement and the judiciary." Commander Jessica Harrington, a senior JAG officer, nodded in agreement. "We've documented 27 cases in this jurisdiction where military personnel of color were subjected to similar treatment. 3 resulted in wrongful convictions that impacted military careers. This appears systematic." Wallace's expression was grim. "Then we treat it as such. This is no longer just about protecting one of our SEALs, though that would be reason enough. This is about addressing a threat to military readiness and the constitutional rights of service members." He turned to Colonel Marcus Barnes of the military police. "How quickly can you assemble a team? We have personnel standing by, sir. 2 hours to full mobilization. Make it 90 minutes. We move before court reconvenes tomorrow." Back at the courthouse, Sarah was buying time with procedural motions, requesting a continuance based on the courtroom incident. Judge Walters, perhaps sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, reluctantly granted a 1-day delay. "But I want it on record that this delay is due to the defendant's disruptive behavior," he added, maintaining the fiction that Darius had somehow provoked Bennett's attack. Outside the courtroom, Maya Johnson was dealing with a different kind of crisis. Anonymous callers had been leaving threatening messages at their home, and that morning she had discovered the words, "Navy traitor" spray-painted on their garage door. Despite her fear, Maya had channeled her energy into coordinating community support, working with veterans groups to ensure the courthouse gallery was filled with military personnel in civilian clothes, silent witnesses to the proceedings. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Zoe Johnson had transformed her initial fear and shame into powerful advocacy. Using social media platforms with the savvy of her generation, she had organized a peaceful student demonstration outside the courthouse with participants wearing navy blue ribbons, symbolizing support for her father. The Charleston Police Department had responded by stationing officers around the protesters, ostensibly for security, but creating an atmosphere of intimidation. Unbeknownst to the Johnson family, Admiral Wallace's team was piecing together a complex web of corruption extending far beyond Officer Bennett. Financial records revealed suspicious payments from a local drug distribution network to accounts linked to several officers, including Police Chief Wilson. Internal affairs investigations had been systematically buried with complainants, often finding themselves targeted for minor offenses shortly after filing reports against officers. Judge Walters had dismissed an unusually high percentage of cases involving police misconduct while imposing maximum sentences on minority defendants for minor crimes. The pattern suggested not just individual bias, but an organized system of protection and profit. In Washington, emergency authorizations were being processed with unprecedented speed, cutting through bureaucratic red tape with the efficiency that only a genuine national security concern could generate. Military police units were quietly being positioned near Charleston, their movements disguised as routine training exercises. JAG officers were preparing warrants based on evidence of corruption that threatened the constitutional rights of service members, establishing the necessary jurisdiction for military intervention. As evening fell over Charleston, Carlos met with Darius and Sarah at the Johnson home, where security had been discreetly enhanced by veterans from Darius's former units. "Something big is happening," Carlos explained, careful to reveal only what was necessary. Admiral Wallace believes this case represents a serious threat to the rights of military personnel. He's invoked special provisions that allow for military jurisdiction when local authorities demonstrate systematic bias against service members. Sarah's eyes widened. That's rarely used. The legal threshold is extremely high. The evidence meets that threshold, Carlos replied simply. I can't share details, but be prepared for significant developments when court reconvenes. Darius, who had remained thoughtfully quiet throughout much of the conversation, finally spoke. I never wanted this to become a military versus civilian authority situation. I just wanted fair treatment under the law. Sometimes exposing injustice requires extraordinary measures, Carlos responded. The Admiral believes this case could set an important precedent for protecting service members' rights. As they discussed possibilities for the next day's proceedings, none of them could have fully anticipated the scale of what Admiral Wallace had set in motion, a coordinated operation that would expose years of corruption and fundamentally reshape Charleston's justice system. Across town, Officer Bennett sat in a bar with several colleagues, drowning his courtroom embarrassment in whiskey and reassuring himself with their supportive comments. Judge Walters will never let this case go south, one officer assured him. He knows how to control his courtroom. Bennett nodded, but a nagging worry persisted. He had lost control today, revealing his true feelings in public. Even with Walters on his side, the expressions on those jurors' faces suggested his testimony might not be as convincing as he had hoped. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, footage from today gone viral. Damage control needed. Bennett's stomach dropped as he realized his courtroom outburst might have consequences beyond what even his protective network could manage. The storm was gathering forces converging from multiple directions, and the quiet courthouse in Charleston was about to become the center of a confrontation with implications far beyond one man's case. Morning light filtered through the high windows of Courtroom 3 as spectators filed in for Day 4 of the trial. The gallery was notably more crowded than previous days, with many new faces appearing in the back rows, their military bearing evident despite their civilian clothes. Sarah Carter arrived early, organizing her materials at the defense table with methodical precision. She had spent most of the night preparing for this crucial day of testimony, unaware of the larger forces now in motion. Darius entered with dignified composure, the small bandage on his forehead, the only visible reminder of yesterday's violence. He noted the increased security presence with additional court officers stationed around the room. Judge Walters swept in precisely at 9, his expression suggesting irritation rather than the contrition one might expect after allowing violence in his courtroom. Before we proceed, he announced after calling the court to order, I want to address yesterday's unfortunate incident. The court record will reflect that the defendant provoked Officer Bennett through confrontational behavior, necessitating a response from court security. Sarah was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, I must object to this characterization. The video evidence clearly shows my client standing calmly while being physically approached and assaulted. Walters glared down from the bench. Miss Carter, this court has already ruled on the matter. Further objections will result in contempt charges. From his seat at the prosecution table, District Attorney Reynolds appeared unusually confident given the previous day's disaster. He leaned over occasionally to whisper with Bennett, who had been permitted to remain in the courtroom despite being a witness, a courtesy rarely extended to anyone testifying against police officers. Bennett's demeanor had transformed overnight from the uncontrolled rage of yesterday to a smug assurance that suggested he knew something others didn't. to prose. When proceedings resumed, Sarah called to the stand Dr. Eliza Washington, a forensic expert who had analyzed the dashcam footage from Bennett's patrol car. Dr. Washington, based on your frame-by-frame analysis, was there any point during the interaction where Mr. Johnson made threatening movements toward Officer Bennett? The expert adjusted her glasses. Number. In fact, the footage shows Mr. Johnson maintaining a non-threatening posture throughout the recorded portion of the encounter, with his hands visible at all times. And what about Officer Bennett's claim that Mr. Johnson was combative during the arrest? The footage contradicts that assertion. Mr. Pravis's Darius Johnson appears to be complying with directions while being subjected to unnecessary force. Judge Walters interrupted. The jury will note that Dr. Washington is offering her interpretation of events, not objective facts. This pattern continued throughout the morning, with Walters consistently undermining defense witnesses while allowing the prosecution free rein. The judge dismissed evidence of Bennett's history of racial incidents as irrelevant, despite their clear bearing on the case. Reynolds seemed particularly pleased when he rose to announce, "The prosecution calls Thomas Weber to the stand." The appearance of this surprise witness caught Sarah off guard. Weber, a clean-cut man in his early 30s, identified himself as a former Marine, now working in the district attorney's office as an investigator. Under Reynolds's friendly questioning, Weber testified that he had reviewed Darius's military records and found inconsistencies that cast doubt on his distinguished service claims. Darius stiffened beside Sarah, the first crack in his composed exterior. They both knew this testimony was fabricated, as military records were not accessible to the DA's office without special authorization. Sarah scribbled a note. "Lying about your record. Why?" As Weber continued his false testimony, Darius studied the man's face with growing recognition. The realization hit suddenly, almost physically. This was Tom Weber, a Marine whose life Darius had saved during a joint operation in Afghanistan 8 years earlier. Weber had been severely wounded, his face damaged by shrapnel requiring reconstructive surgery that had altered his appearance. Darius had carried him 2 miles to an extraction point under heavy enemy fire. How could he now be testifying against the man who had saved his life? Carlos returned to the courtroom just as Weber was finishing his testimony, slipping into the seat behind Sarah, with a barely perceptible nod that communicated something significant had changed. Sarah rose for cross-examination, approaching Weber with deceptive casualness. "Mr. Weber, you testified that you reviewed Mr. Johnson's military record. Could you tell the court exactly how you gained access to those classified documents?" Weber shifted uncomfortably. "Through proper channels in the course of the investigation." "Specific channels, please," Sarah pressed. "Which department authorized this access?" Reynolds was on his feet. "Objection. The methods of the district attorney's investigation are not on trial here." Sustained. Walters ruled immediately. "Move on, Miss Carter." Sarah changed tactics smoothly. "Mr. Haffen, Weber, you served in the Marines, correct? Were you ever deployed to Afghanistan?" Weber's expression tightened. "Yes, 2 tours." "During your second tour, were you ever involved in joint operations with Navy SEAL teams?" Reynolds objected again, but Sarah argued successfully that the question established the witness's expertise on military matters. Weber answered reluctantly. "Yes, occasionally." "Were you ever wounded during these operations?" Sarah continued, moving closer to the witness stand. Weber's hand unconsciously moved to the right side of his face, where skillful surgery had repaired substantial damage. "Yes, during an ambush in Kandahar province." "And were you rescued by a member of a SEAL team?" Weber's eyes finally met Darius's recognition and shame flickering briefly before he looked away. "I was evacuated by multiple personnel, Mr. Weber." Sarah said quietly, "Is it possible that one of those personnel was the defendant, Darius Johnson?" Before Weber could answer, the courtroom doors opened, and several military police officers in full uniform entered, taking positions at the back of the room. A ripple of confusion moved through the gallery. Judge Walters banged his gavel. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" At that moment, Carlos's phone buzzed with a text message. He leaned forward to whisper to Sarah, "It's happening. Keep Weber on the stand as long as possible." Sarah nodded imperceptibly and returned to her questioning. "Mr. Weber, I'll ask again. Did Darius Johnson save your life in Afghanistan?" Weber glanced nervously between Darius Reynolds and the military officers at the back of the room. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, the atmosphere charged with tension. "I don't recall the names of all personnel involved," he finally answered, his voice lacking conviction. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory," Sarah said, producing a photograph from her files. "This is a military commendation ceremony where Sergeant Darius Johnson received the Silver Star for heroism in combat. And that's you in the background before your facial reconstruction, applauding the man who carried you 2 miles under enemy fire." Reynolds leapt to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness with irrelevant material." Judge Walters seemed about to sustain the objection when he noticed more military personnel quietly entering the courtroom, including a distinguished older man in an admiral's uniform who took a seat in the back row. Walters hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "I'll allow the question. The witness will answer." Weber looked trapped, caught between the corrupt system he had joined and the undeniable truth of his own rescue. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "Darius Johnson saved my life. I wouldn't be here without him." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "And yet you came here today to lie about his military record," Sarah stated, not a question but a damning summation. "Objection," Reynolds shouted, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Weber's face crumpled. "I was ordered to testify," he whispered. "They said my job depended on it." Before Reynolds could object again, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened fully, and a contingent of military police officers in full tactical gear entered, led by Colonel Marcus Barnes. "This court is now under the jurisdiction of the United States military justice system," Colonel Barnes announced in a voice accustomed to command. "I have federal warrants for the arrests of Judge Harold Walters, District Attorney Victor Reynolds, and Officer Richard Bennett on charges of conspiracy against rights, obstruction of justice, and violations of the civil rights of military personnel." Judge Walters' face drained of color. "This is an outrage. You have no authority here." From the back of the courtroom, Admiral Wallace rose to his feet. "We have every authority, Your Honor, under U.S. Code Title 10. Section 807 military jurisdiction applies when local authorities systematically violate the constitutional rights of service members. We have documented evidence of a conspiracy targeting military personnel of color in this jurisdiction. As the implications of these words sank in, Bennett made a desperate move toward the side door, only to find it blocked by military police. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Reynolds demanded to see the warrants. Walters continued to protest the jurisdiction, and spectators reacted with everything from shock to vindication. Amid the tumult, Darius remained, seated, his expression reflecting not triumph but the solemn recognition that justice, while delayed, was finally arriving with thunderous force. Have you ever witnessed a moment when truth finally overcomes corruption? Comment number 1. If you believe the military was justified in intervening to protect their own, or number 2, if you think they overstepped their authority. What would you have done if you were in Darius's position, facing a system that seemed determined to crush you despite your service to the country? The storm has arrived, but the aftermath may be even more dramatic than you expect. Like and subscribe to see how this explosive confrontation resolves. Will justice finally prevail for Darius Johnson? What secrets will be revealed when the corrupt system is finally exposed? And how will this change the lives of everyone involved? The most shocking revelations are still to come. The next few minutes unfolded with the precision of a military operation, which was exactly what it was. Colonel Barnes produced the federal warrants, the crisp official documents, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting in the courtroom. 2 military police officers approached the bench, while others moved toward District Attorney Reynolds and Officer Bennett. "Harold Walters, you are under arrest for conspiracy against rights under color of law. obstruction of justice, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding the rights of service members, the lead officer stated formally, her voice cutting through the noise. Judge Walters, his face now flushed with rage, slammed his gavel repeatedly. "I will hold every one of you in contempt. This is my courtroom." Admiral Wallace stepped forward, his decades of command evident in his bearing. "This courthouse exists within the United States of America, Judge Walters, a nation whose Constitution you swore to uphold. That Constitution provides for military jurisdiction when civilian authorities systematically violate the rights of service members. Your courtroom is subject to those same laws." As Walters was being read, his right similar scenes played out simultaneously with Reynolds and Bennett. Reynolds blustered about calling the governor, while Bennett's earlier confidence had evaporated, entirely replaced by the panicked look of a man who suddenly realized his protective network had collapsed. From the witness stand, Thomas Weber watched with a mixture of shame and relief as the corrupt system that had coerced his false testimony crumbled before his eyes. The jury sat in stunned silence, witnesses to a historic assertion of military authority over civilian corruption. Sarah Carter, though surprised by the timing, had recovered her professional composure. "Your Honor," she addressed Colonel Barnes, who had temporarily assumed authority over the proceedings. "In light of these developments, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." Barnes nodded. "The motion is granted. Mr. Johnson, you are free to go with the military's apologies for the injustice you have endured." As Darius stood, the gallery erupted in applause, led by the military personnel who had infiltrated the audience. Carlos moved to Darius's side, a protective gesture born of years of battlefield brotherhood. The arrested officials were being escorted from the courtroom when Admiral Wallace requested a moment to address those present. "What you are witnessing today is not an action taken lightly." He began, his voice commanding immediate attention. "For over 2 years, military intelligence has been tracking a pattern of civil rights violations against service members of color in multiple jurisdictions. Charleston emerged as a particular hotspot, with 18 documented cases of Navy and Marine Corps personnel being targeted for discriminatory treatment." He gestured toward Darius. Petty Officer Johnson's case became the catalyst for intervention due to the egregious nature of the violations and the clear evidence of coordinated corruption. The United States military stands by its pledge to protect all who serve, both from foreign enemies and from domestic injustice. The Admiral then produced a folder containing documents that he handed to a military legal officer. These records detail a conspiracy involving Judge Walters, D.A. Reynolds, Police Chief Wilson, and several officers, including Richard Bennett. They have systematically targeted military personnel of color for harassment, false arrests, and prosecutions designed to damage or end military careers. The revelation sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Journalists who had been covering the trial frantically took notes or quietly called their editors, recognizing that the story had expanded far beyond one man's case into a major federal intervention. Carlos's phone buzzed with an incoming text. After checking it, he whispered to Darius, "Maya and Zoe are outside with a military escort. They've been brought here to meet you." For the first time since the trial began, Darius's composed expression gave way to visible emotion, the thought of reuniting with his family bringing unexpected tears to his eyes. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again, and Maya and Zoe Johnson entered, flanked by 2 female military officers. Zoe broke protocol by running forward to embrace her father, while Maya followed with more measured steps but equal emotion. Their reunion became the human center of the procedural storm still swirling around them. Meanwhile, the evidence gathering continued. Military police were securing computers and files from Judge Walters' chambers and the district attorney's office. Bennett's phone had been confiscated, its contents already being downloaded and analyzed by military intelligence specialists. The video Carlos had captured of Bennett's courtroom assault on Darius was being shown on a monitor, the visual evidence devastating to any claim that Darius had been the aggressor. From the witness stand, Thomas Weber made a decision that would alter the course of his life. "I want to make a full statement," he announced, his voice stronger now. "I was coerced into giving false testimony, but that doesn't excuse my actions. I owe my life to Petty Officer Johnson and I betrayed him today. Colonel Barnes nodded. We'll take your full statement as part of the investigation, Mr. Weber. Weber's eyes found Darius across the courtroom. I'm sorry, he said simply. When they reconstructed my face, after the injury, I didn't think anyone from that day would recognize me. But you did, didn't you? Darius nodded. I remembered your eyes, he replied. They don't change. The personal moment amidst the legal drama reminded everyone present that behind the procedures and jurisdictional battles were human lives profoundly affected by the corruption being exposed. As the initial shock subsided, Colonel Barnes established temporary order in the courtroom. This proceeding is now adjourned. A joint military-civilian task force will continue the investigation into the pattern of civil rights violations. All records from this case will be preserved as evidence. For Darius and his family, the sudden shift from defendant to vindicated victim was disorienting. Sarah gathered her materials, still processing the dramatic turn of events. I knew something was happening behind the scenes, she told Darius, but nothing of this magnitude. The military doesn't intervene in civilian courts without extraordinary cause. The cause was extraordinary, Admiral Wallace said, approaching their group. Darius, it's been too many years. The two men embraced briefly, the formality of rank temporarily set aside. When Carlos brought this case to my attention, I recognized your name immediately. The SEAL, who carried a wounded Marine 2 miles under enemy fire, doesn't deserve to be treated like a criminal in the country he serves. Outside the courthouse, the scene was equally dramatic. News crews captured footage of Walters, Reynolds, and Bennett being escorted to military vehicles, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and anger. Protesters who had gathered in support of Darius cheered as he emerged with his family, while a smaller group of police supporters watched in confused silence as their narrative of a routine arrest and justified prosecution disintegrated before their eyes. Maya squeezed her husband's hand as they faced the media barrage. No comment at this time, Darius stated firmly, his focus on protecting his family from further exposure. Colonel Barnes provided an official statement to the press. The United States military has exercised its legal authority to intervene in a case involving systematic civil rights violations against service members. This action was taken after extensive evidence gathering and with proper federal authorization. The investigation is ongoing, and further details will be released when appropriate. Back inside the courthouse, the Joint Task Force was already setting up operations in a commandeered conference room. Military intelligence officers worked alongside FBI agents who had been quietly investigating the Charleston justice system for months. The evidence they were uncovering painted a disturbing picture of coordinated corruption, falsified police reports targeting specific demographics, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and judicial misconduct, designed to protect officers like Bennett while securing convictions against targeted individuals. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a group text chain between Bennett Judge Walters and several other officers discussing Darius's case with explicitly racist language and planning how to ensure his conviction regardless of evidence. The documentation was damning, revealing not isolated incidents of bias, but a systematic effort to use the justice system as a weapon against minorities, particularly those with military connections. As the day progressed, the ripple effects spread throughout Charleston. Police Chief Wilson was taken into custody at his office. The mayor called an emergency press conference to express shock and promise cooperation with federal authorities, though later evidence would implicate members of his staff in the cover-up of previous complaints. For Darius and his family, the vindication brought relief, but not complete healing. The trauma of the false arrest, the months of anxiety, and the public humiliation had left scars that would take time to fade. That evening, as they gathered in their home with Carlos and Sarah, protected by a military security detail, Darius finally allowed himself to process the emotions he had suppressed throughout the ordeal. I never wanted to be the center of a federal case, he told them, the weight of the day evident in his voice. I just wanted to be treated with the same respect I've shown throughout my career. Maya rested her head on his shoulder. Sometimes justice requires a thunderstorm, not just a gentle rain. Outside their window, Media vans still lined the street, their lights visible through the curtains. The story had gone national, with breaking news alerts interrupting regular programming. What had begun as one man's struggle against local injustice had exposed a corruption network that would ultimately lead to dozens of arrests and the review of hundreds of previous convictions. For now, though, Darius focused on the simple relief of being home with his family. The immediate danger passed, even as the larger battle for systematic justice continued. In the quiet of their living room, far from the cameras and legal proceedings, Darius Johnson finally spoke the truth he had maintained in his heart throughout the ordeal. "I never lost faith in the principles I've defended. Today showed that the system can correct itself, even if it sometimes requires extraordinary measures to make that happen." The Charleston County Courthouse had never seen such activity. 24 hours after the military intervention, the historic building had become the command center for a joint task force investigating what the media was now calling the Charleston Corruption Ring. Military police secured the perimeter, while teams of investigators methodically worked through offices that had previously been inaccessible, gathering evidence that had been hidden for years. In a makeshift press area, established on the courthouse steps, journalists from national networks jostled for position as Colonel Barnes delivered the latest update. "We have uncovered documentation of at least 47 cases where military personnel of color were specifically targeted for harassment, false arrests, and malicious prosecution." He announced, his military bearing a stark contrast to the political polish of the local officials who typically occupied that spot. The conspiracy extended to multiple levels of local government, with evidence suggesting involvement from the police department, district attorney's office, judicial chambers, and possibly beyond. The fallout was spreading like ripples in a pond. Police Chief Wilson had been formally charged after investigators discovered offshore accounts containing unexplained deposits that coincided with dismissals of internal affairs investigations. Judge Walter's home had been searched, yielding a safe containing blackmail material on several local officials' insurance for his continued protection. District Attorney Reynolds had already begun negotiations through his attorney, offering information on others in exchange for leniency. Officer Bennett, facing the most serious charges due to his direct actions against Darius and other service members, had been denied bail after military intelligence intercepted communications suggesting he was planning to flee the jurisdiction. For Darius Johnson, the vindication was overwhelming but complex. After spending the morning giving detailed testimony to military investigators, he emerged from the courthouse to find a crowd of supporters waiting, many holding signs thanking him for exposing the corruption. Veterans in particular had rallied around his cause, seeing in his ordeal a reflection of challenges many had faced upon returning to civilian life. "Brother, you stood strong," an older Vietnam veteran told him, gripping Darius's hand firmly. "You showed them what military bearing really means." Maya had taken a leadership role in helping other families who had been victimized by the corrupt system. Her hospital administration experience proved valuable in organizing resources and support services for those whose lives had been derailed by false charges or excessive sentencing. That afternoon, she facilitated a meeting between families of military and civilian victims, building bridges across communities that had previously been divided by the strategic manipulation of local authorities. "They wanted us fighting each other instead of recognizing our common enemy," she explained to the group gathered in a community center. "Divide and conquer is an ancient strategy, but it only works when we allow ourselves to be divided." Zoe Johnson had become an unexpected symbol of youth resistance to injustice. Her social media accounts documenting her father's case had exploded in popularity, and she was using her new platform to highlight similar cases across the country. Schools throughout Charleston were organizing discussions about civil rights and the justice system, with Zoe frequently invited to speak about her family's experience. "I used to think justice was automatic," she told a group of her peers during a lunch-hour forum. "Now I understand it's something we have to actively work for and protect." The revelations continued to mount as more victims came forward, emboldened by the federal intervention. A retired teacher described being pulled over 11 times in a single month by Bennett and his colleagues, each time without legitimate cause. A black business owner revealed how his complaints about police harassment had been followed by surprise health and safety inspections that threatened his license. A group of military spouses detailed a pattern of targeting when their partners were deployed, creating stress and hardship for families already dealing with the challenges of separation. Perhaps most disturbing were the emerging connections between the corruption ring and local hate groups. Digital forensics had recovered deleted messages from Bennett's devices, showing his participation in white supremacist forums where he had shared information about minority residents for potential harassment. Judge Walter's emails revealed communications with wealthy donors who explicitly supported his tough approach to maintaining the traditional character of Charleston coded language for racial segregation and intimidation. For Carlos Mendoza, the operation was personal and professional validation. As a military intelligence specialist who had advocated for intervention months earlier, he had faced skepticism from superiors concerned about the political implications of military involvement in civilian matters. Now, as the evidence mounted vindicating his assessment, he was receiving recognition for his persistence in protecting fellow service members. "The military has a sacred obligation to those who serve," he explained to Admiral Wallace during a private briefing. "When local authorities systematically target our personnel based on race, it's not just a civil rights issue, but a direct threat to military readiness and morale." The Admiral nodded in agreement. "The precedent being established here will protect service members for generations to come." While the legal proceedings moved forward, Darius faced his own internal reckoning. The disciplined SEAL who had maintained his composure through combat and courtroom now struggled with the psychological aftermath of prolonged injustice. Nightmares disrupted his sleep, replaying the moment of Bennett's attack in the courtroom with variations where the outcome was far worse. Hypervigilance kept him on edge during routine activities, his combat-trained senses now triggered by police sirens or unexpected knocks at the door. "It's not weakness," the military psychologist assured him during their second session. "It's a normal response to sustained threat and injustice. Your military training helped you survive the experience, but it also taught you to compartmentalize trauma rather than process it." Darius nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. In combat, there's clarity. Enemies and allies are defined. This was different facing an enemy wearing the badge that's supposed to represent protection. The healing process would take time, but acknowledging the impact was the essential first step. Meanwhile, the community response continued to evolve. Initial shock had given way to outrage, then determination for systematic change. Town halls throughout Charleston were packed with residents demanding transparency and accountability. The mayor himself, under increasing scrutiny for possible knowledge of the corruption, announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee for police activities, though critics noted that without federal supervision, such measures had failed before. More victims of Bennett and the corrupt system came forward daily, their stories creating a damning mosaic of systematic oppression. A local law firm had begun assembling a class-action lawsuit on behalf of those wrongfully arrested or convicted with potential damages reaching into the millions. Civil rights organizations established a presence in Charleston, offering legal support and documentation services for those affected. National politicians began weighing in, some calling for federal oversight of local police departments with histories of discrimination, others warning against military overreach into civilian affairs. The case had ignited a broader conversation about justice, race, and accountability that extended far beyond Charleston's borders. That evening, as Darius and Maya prepared for bed, the weight of the day's testimonies and revelations hung heavy between them. "The Admiral offered me a promotion," Darius said quietly, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Special assignment training new SEAL candidates with a focus on ethical decision-making under pressure." Maya sat beside him, taking his hand. "Is that what you want?" Darius sighed, the question touching on uncertainties he had been avoiding. "I've given 15 years to a system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. Finding out how deeply the rot goes right here at home makes me question everything." "Not everything," Maya corrected gently. "It doesn't change the good you've done, the lives you've saved, the principles you've upheld. If anything, it shows why people like you are needed more than ever." Outside their window, a police car drove slowly past their house, part of the new protection detail assigned by the interim police chief after threats had been made against the family. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that the same department that had victimized Darius was now tasked with ensuring his safety. As they turned out the lights, Darius reflected on the unfinished nature of the justice now unfolding. Bennett, Walters, and Reynolds would face consequences, but the systems that had empowered them remained largely intact. True change would require more than prosecuting individual bad actors. It would demand reimagining institutions designed to protect power rather than serve justice. The reckoning had begun, but its ultimate impact would depend on whether this moment of clarity led to sustained transformation or merely temporary adjustments to a fundamentally flawed system. For now, Darius took comfort in the knowledge that his stand had created an opening for change, a crack in the edifice of institutional racism that might, with continued pressure, lead to more fundamental reform. It wasn't the clean resolution of a battlefield victory, but it was a meaningful step in a longer struggle for the justice he had always believed in. 6 months had passed since the dramatic courtroom intervention that exposed the Charleston corruption ring. The historic city was transformed not just by the personnel changes in its justice system, but by a fundamental shift in how its institutions operated and how its citizens engaged with them. On a crisp autumn morning, Darius Johnson stood at the podium in the community center that had become the headquarters for Charleston's Police Reform Commission. Before him sat a diverse group of community leaders, law enforcement officials, and ordinary citizens committed to ensuring that the changes implemented in recent months would become permanent improvements rather than temporary responses to a crisis. Accountability isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. Darius explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had always commanded respect among his SEAL teammates. It's about creating systems where doing the right thing is rewarded and protected. The journey to this moment had been tumultuous for everyone involved. The federal investigation had ultimately resulted in 32 indictments across multiple departments and agencies. Officer Richard Bennett was facing 20 years in federal prison after being convicted on multiple civil rights violations, conspiracy charges, and assault. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, including text messages where he explicitly discussed targeting military personnel of color to teach them their place. Judge Harold Walters had agreed to a plea deal, providing testimony against higher-level officials in exchange for a reduced sentence. His detailed account of how cases were manipulated had led to the review of over 500 previous convictions, with 89 already overturned and many more under examination. District Attorney Victor Reynolds had attempted to position himself as a whistleblower caught in a corrupt system, but his own records betrayed his central role in coordinating prosecutorial misconduct. He was now serving a 12-year sentence in a federal facility, his law license permanently revoked. The broader impacts extended throughout Charleston's government. The police department was under new leadership with Chief Alicia Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for integrity, implementing comprehensive reforms, including body cameras with automatic uploading to prevent tampering, civilian oversight of disciplinary processes, and mandatory bias training. The mayor had resigned amid revelations that he had been aware of the corruption but had chosen political expediency over intervention. His replacement, a former civil rights attorney, had campaigned on a platform of transparency and accountability. For the Johnson family, the aftermath had brought both healing and new purpose. Maya had formalized her community support work by establishing the Johnson Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization providing resources to families affected by misconduct in the justice system. With funding from civil rights organizations and staffed partially by law students from nearby universities, the initiative had already helped dozens of families navigate the complex process of having unjust convictions reviewed. Zoe, now 17 and in her senior year of high school, had founded Youth for Justice, a student organization dedicated to education about civil rights and community engagement. What had begun in her school had spread to 11 other high schools across the county, creating a network of young people committed to maintaining vigilance against systemic abuses. Darius himself had faced difficult decisions about his military future. The Navy had offered him promotion and commendation for his role in exposing corruption that threatened service members. But the traumatic experience had left him questioning whether to continue his SEAL career. The PTSD symptoms that had emerged after his ordeal had required intensive therapy with Darius, eventually becoming an advocate for mental health services among veterans and victims of systemic injustice. The training teaches us to compartmentalize trauma and keep moving forward, he often explained in the support groups he now facilitated. But eventually those compartments fill up. Processing the pain isn't weakness. It's necessary maintenance for continued strength. After months of consideration, Darius had made the difficult decision to retire from active SEAL duty. The choice wasn't an escape, but a redirection of his commitment to service. He now divided his time between consulting on police reform initiatives and working with military personnel transitioning to civilian life, particularly those who had experienced discrimination or injustice. Thomas Weber, the former assistant district attorney, who had been coerced into giving false testimony against Darius, had undergone his own transformation. After resigning from the DA's office and cooperating fully with investigators, he had joined a legal aid organization providing representation to underserved communities. His first-hand experience with corruption had converted him into an outspoken advocate for ethical prosecution and defensive of defendants' rights. He and Darius had developed an unlikely alliance, appearing together at law schools and police academies to discuss the importance of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Sarah Carter, whose determined legal defense had laid the groundwork for exposing the corruption, had become one of the most sought-after civil rights attorneys in the region. She now led a team specializing in cases similar to Darius's, with a growing record of successful challenges to discriminatory practices in law enforcement. What happened in Charleston wasn't unique, she explained during a national news interview. What was unique was the military's intervention and the comprehensive investigation that followed. We're working to achieve similar accountability without requiring such extraordinary measures. The broader implications of the case continued to unfold across the country. Military advocates had successfully lobbied for expanded protections for service members facing discrimination in civilian settings. Federal guidelines for police departments had been updated to include specific protocols for interactions with military personnel, with enhanced penalties for civil rights violations against those serving in the armed forces. More fundamentally, the Charleston case had become a landmark example of how deeply embedded corruption could be exposed, and addressed inspiring similar investigations in other jurisdictions with histories of systematic discrimination. The story had maintained national attention through comprehensive documentary coverage and ongoing legal proceedings against higher-level officials implicated in the conspiracy. On this particular morning, as Darius concluded his presentation to the Reform Commission, an unexpected visitor slipped into the back of the room. Admiral Raymond Wallace, now retired, but still commanding respect in his civilian attire, had come to witness firsthand the changes his intervention had helped create. After the meeting adjourned, he approached Darius with a warm handshake. "You've built something important here," the Admiral observed, looking around at the diverse group of citizens engaged in animated discussion about policing policies. "More important than what we accomplished through military channels." Darius nodded in acknowledgement. The military intervention stopped the immediate injustice, but this, he gestured to the community members. This is what prevents it from happening again. Engage citizens who understand that justice requires constant vigilance. As they walked together toward the exit, a young police cadet approached Darius tentatively. "Sir, I just wanted to say that your case is why I decided to enter law enforcement. I want to be part of the solution." The sincere comment reflected the unexpected positive outcome of the ordeal, inspiring a new generation of police officers committed to equitable justice and community service. Outside the community center, Charleston continued its daily rhythms, the historic city moving forward while reckoning with its past. Tour guides now included information about the corruption case, alongside stories of the city's Civil War history, acknowledging difficult truths rather than perpetuating comfortable myths. The courthouse, where Darius had faced injustice, now housed a permanent exhibit on civil rights and judicial accountability, a reminder of both institutional failure and the possibility of meaningful reform. That evening, the Johnson family gathered for dinner with Carlos Serra and several other key figures from their journey. The conversation flowed easily between reflection on the past and plans for the future, punctuated by moments of laughter that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of their ordeal. As Maya brought out dessert, Darius's phone buzzed with a news alert. Bennett's former partner had come forward with additional evidence revealing corruption extending to state-level officials who had helped cover up previous incidents. The revelation would likely trigger another round of investigations and prosecutions. "It never really ends, does it?" Zoe observed, reading the alert over her father's shoulder. "One layer exposes another." Darius nodded thoughtfully. "Justice isn't a destination we reach once and then relax. It's a path we have to keep walking, a commitment we renew every day." The simple truth resonated around the table. What had begun with one man's unjust traffic stop had evolved into a movement for accountability that continued to gather momentum. For Darius Johnson, the Navy SEAL who had faced enemies abroad only to confront systemic racism at home, the fight for justice had transformed from a personal battle into a community mission. The scars remained both visible and invisible, but they had become badges of resilience rather than wounds of victimization. As the evening concluded and their guests departed, Darius stood on the porch of the home that had once been vandalized with hateful messages. The same neighborhood that had once shunned them now hosted community watch meetings and diversity celebrations. Change was possible, sometimes requiring thunderous intervention, but always sustained through persistent, everyday commitment to better principles. In his new role teaching ethics and justice to mixed classes of police cadets and military personnel, Darius often concluded with the same message. True power isn't in the ability to control others, but in the courage to stand firm when facing injustice, and the wisdom to build systems that make justice more likely than its opposite. It was this philosophy that now guided Charleston's reformed institutions and inspired communities across the country facing similar challenges. The story of a Black Navy SEAL who endured and exposed corruption had become more than a cautionary tale of injustice. It had evolved into a blueprint for transformation and a testament to the enduring power of dignity in the face of oppression. What do you think is the most important lesson from Darius Johnson's story? Was it his dignity under pressure, the power of community support, or the importance of holding systems accountable? Comment below with your thoughts. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to see more powerful stories of justice and transformation. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that change is possible even in the most entrenched systems. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one man's fight for justice that became a catalyst for change. Remember, in the words of Darius himself, justice isn't a destination we reach once and then relax. It's a path we have to keep walking, a commitment we renew every day. Darius Johnson's journey teaches us that justice requires vigilance, courage, and community action. When systems designed to protect everyone instead become weapons of oppression, standing firm in your dignity becomes an act of revolution. The story shows how institutional racism operates, not just through individual bias, but through coordinated networks that protect corrupt actors while targeting minorities. True change demands more than removing bad apples. It requires transforming entire systems and the culture that enables discrimination. Darius's military discipline provided strength during his ordeal, but healing required acknowledging trauma rather than suppressing it. We see that power concedes nothing without demand. Without the evidence, gathering, community organizing, and outside intervention, injustice would have prevailed. The military's protection of its service member reminds us that institutions can be forces for accountability when properly mobilized. Most importantly, this story reveals that justice isn't achieved through a single victory, but through sustained commitment. Each exposed layer of corruption creates opportunity for deeper reform. When ordinary citizens become engaged, watchdogs of power, lasting change becomes possible. The ultimate lesson is that dignity cannot be taken unless surrendered. Despite facing overwhelming odds, Darius maintained his integrity, transforming personal injustice into a catalyst for community healing and systematic change. What moment in Darius's story resonated most deeply with you? Have you ever witnessed injustice and felt powerless to stop it, or have you been part of creating positive change in your community? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help more people discover it. The fight against systemic racism requires all of us to stay informed and engaged, so subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and transformation. Consider sharing this video with someone who might be losing faith that real change is possible. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one man's stand against corruption. Remember, in the words of Darius Johnson, justice isn't a destination, but a path we must walk together every day. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never stop believing in the power of dignity to overcome oppression.